A fisherman was casting his nets at sea when he suddenly heard a strange noise coming from a rocky cluster. Cautiously approaching to investigate, something miraculous appeared before him, leaving him in awe. John moved with the rhythm of the tide. His days began early, before the sun had fully risen, when the horizon was still a muted grey and the scent of the ocean filled the air. The mornings were quiet, almost sacred in their stillness, as John prepared his boat for another day at sea. In the solitude of dawn, he found a strange kind of peace, though it was a peace tinged with the heaviness of loss. Rivertown had always been home to John. It was a small place, tucked away from the bustling cities where life moved at a slower pace, dictated by the weather and the water. The town itself was built along a narrow strip of coastline, with wooden houses lining the harbour, their roofs weathered from the salt and wind. Fishing was the lifeblood of Rivertown, and for as long as John could remember, he had been part of that life. His father had been a fisherman, a man of few words but strong hands. John had learned the trade young, standing knee-deep in the surf, pulling in nets beside his father. The sea had been a constant in their lives, both a source of sustenance and a place of escape. As a boy, John had marveled at the endless horizon, dreaming of adventures and distant lands. But as he grew older, those dreams had faded, replaced by the steady rhythm of life in Rivertown. John's mother had worked alongside his father, but her strength lay in the kitchen. She had turned their small home into a place where sailors and townsfolk alike would gather for a meal. The meals were simple but hearty, and the kitchen was always filled with the comforting smells of baked bread and stew. Those were the days when John's world was whole, when the house was full of warmth and laughter, though his parents' conversations were often brief and practical. As the years passed, John took on more responsibility, especially after his father's health began to fail. The sea had taken its toll on the old man, and it was clear he wouldn't last much longer. John became the head of the household, fishing by day and taking over the family business in the evenings. He never complained. It was the life he had always known. But there were moments, late at night, when he sat by the window and looked out at the water, wondering what else might have been. He had once thought of leaving, of taking a chance on something different. His parents had even suggested it. His mother, in particular, had hoped he would go to the city to see more of the world. But John had stayed. Rivertown had a pull on him, a deep-rooted connection that he could never quite explain. The sea was in his blood, just as it had been in his father's. Now, with both of his parents gone and the family home standing silent, John's days were filled with routine. He would rise before the sun, make his way to the dock, and prepare his boat for the day ahead. The boat itself was small but reliable, just like the one his father had owned. He took pride in its upkeep, checking the nets and lines, making sure everything was in place before setting off into the open water. The other fishermen in Rivertown had tried to bring him into their fold, inviting him to join them for drinks at the end of the day or for a meal at the local tavern. But John always declined, preferring the quiet of his own company. He wasn't unfriendly, but there was a distance between him and the rest of the town that everyone seemed to understand. They left him alone, respecting his solitude, though they occasionally watched him with pity in their eyes. The sea had a way of healing and wounding at the same time. Some days, as John sat in his boat, watching the waves roll and listening to the cry of gulls, he felt as though the ocean might wash away the grief that weighed so heavily on his chest. But other days, the water seemed to hold all of his pain, the endless horizon mocking him with its unreachable distance. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the harbour, painting the sky in deep oranges and purples, John met Emily. She was standing at the edge of the dock, watching the water with a kind of intensity that immediately caught his attention. There was something different about her, something that pulled him in, though he couldn't quite place it. "Beautiful sunset," she said without looking away from the horizon. John nodded, unsure how to respond at first. He wasn't used to people just striking up conversations with him, not anymore. But there was something in her voice, something warm and genuine that made him want to stay, just for a moment longer. "Yeah, it's peaceful," he finally replied, though the word felt inadequate. Nothing had felt truly peaceful to him for a long time. Emily turned to face him then, and John was taken aback by the brightness in her eyes, a lightness that contrasted sharply with the weight he had been carrying. "I'm Emily," she said, offering her hand. "John," he responded, shaking it, surprised at how natural it felt to talk to her. From that evening on, they found themselves running into each other often, at the docks, in town, or during his quiet walks along the shore. Their conversations started casually, but soon they deepened. Emily wasn't like the others in Rivertown. She didn't just ask about the catch or the weather. She wanted to know about him, really know him. She asked about his life, his family, what it was like to live by the sea. And slowly, John found himself opening up, telling her about his parents, the fishing, and the long, lonely nights. She listened, really listened. And in return, she shared her own stories, her travels before coming to Rivertown, and how she had always been drawn to the ocean, though she had no particular reason why. There was a quiet understanding between them, a shared sense of seeking something more, something they couldn't quite name. Their relationship grew naturally, with no forced conversations or grand gestures. They walked together along the beach, the sound of waves crashing the only backdrop to their long talks. In Emily, John found a warmth he hadn't known he needed. She didn't try to fix him or offer him any hollow comforts. She simply was there, present, and that was enough. Months passed, and one day, during a quiet afternoon at the harbour, Emily told him she was pregnant. The words hit John in a way he hadn't expected. He stood there, silent for a moment, his mind reeling not from fear, but from the overwhelming sense of something new, something he had thought was lost forever. Emily looked at him with a slight smile, waiting for him to respond. "We're going to have a baby," John finally said, almost to himself, the reality of it slowly sinking in. Emily's smile widened. "Yes, we are." It wasn't long before the small house that had once felt empty and desolate began to fill with life again. They made preparations for the baby together, repainting the rooms, building cribs, and filling the house with laughter and light once more. The arrival of their son, Jack, was a quiet but profound moment. In the soft cries of the newborn, John felt a stirring of hope, hope that he had long buried. He looked at Emily, who held the baby in her arms, and realized that, for the first time in years, he was no longer just surviving. He was living again. The wind picked up that morning, a low, steady howl that swept through the streets of Rivertown, rattling the windows of John's home. He stood by the window, his eyes tracing the dark clouds gathering on the horizon. The sea was restless, its surface churned up by the approaching storm. It had been years since a storm like this had rolled in, and with it an unease settled deep in John's chest. It was the same kind of storm. The memory had been buried deep, but now, as the first raindrops splattered against the window, it came flooding back. The air had felt just like this, heavy, suffocating. He could still hear the sound of the wind that night, how it had grown louder, angrier, as if the world itself were tearing apart. John clenched his fists, his breath shallow. He didn't want to remember, but the storm outside left him no choice. The day Emily and Jack were taken from him had been eerily similar. Dark clouds, wind that screamed through the gaps in the house, and a rising panic he couldn't shake. It had started like any other evening. They were inside, the three of them, while the wind battered the coastline. John had reassured Emily, holding Jack close as the baby fussed. He remembered telling her it would pass, that it was just another storm. But deep down, something felt wrong. The storm grew worse, and then the power went out. The world outside had become a chaotic blur of wind and rain. John had rushed to the windows, checking the locks, trying to calm the rising fear in his chest. He could feel Emily watching him, her usual calmness shaken. "John, do you think we should go somewhere safer?" she had asked, her voice steady but tinged with concern. She held Jack tightly against her, shielding him as best she could. "We'll be fine," he had said, but he wasn't sure. Not this time. The night dragged on. The wind grew stronger, howling through the cracks, and the rain beat down harder than John had ever seen. He tried to keep them all calm, but there was no controlling the storm outside, or the fear it ignited inside him. He had gone to check on the boat, his only thought to secure it before it was torn loose by the storm. But, in the chaos, something happened. The sound of splintering wood, a scream cut short by the wind's roar, and by the time he ran back inside, it was too late. The door had blown open, and the last thing he remembered was the sight of Emily, holding Jack, being swept away by the relentless force of the storm. The days after that were a blur. He joined the search, running along the beach until his legs gave out, screaming their names into the wind, though he knew they couldn't hear him. The sea, which had once been his refuge, now felt like a vast, cruel expanse, hiding the people he loved most. They were never found. The storm outside now raged, pulling John back into the present. The house groaned under the weight of the wind, and he could feel the cold seep through the walls. The sky had turned a deep, angry grey, the waves crashing violently against the shore. It was as if the sea had come alive again, taunting him with the memory of what it had taken. John stepped back from the window, his hands trembling. He hadn't allowed himself to feel the full weight of that night in a long time. He had buried it deep, telling himself that moving on was the only way to survive. But now, with the storm mirroring his past, the grief was impossible to ignore. He sat down at the kitchen table, his eyes unfocused as the rain drummed harder against the roof. He could still see Emily's face, the way she had looked at him before the door had blown open, the silent plea in her eyes. He could still hear Jack's cry, muffled by the wind. The storm outside grew fiercer, but it was nothing compared to the one inside him. Cedar Bay was a place untouched by time, a hidden corner of the coast, where the waves lapped gently against the rocks, and the wind moved through the trees like a whisper. John often found himself there, far from the familiarity of Rivertown, far from the memories that clung to every corner of his old life. Out here, the world felt distant, and that suited him fine. His routine had become mechanical. Every morning he'd load up his boat with just enough supplies to get through the day, no more, no less. He'd cast off from the harbour, steering the salty dog toward Cedar Bay, where the only sounds were the gulls overhead and the rhythmic pull of the tide. He rarely caught much fish these days, but that wasn't why he came. He came for the silence. Today was no different. John's mind was numb, his body on autopilot as he tied the boat to a tree near the shore. The sand was soft under his boots as he walked along the beach, the salty breeze tugging at his worn jacket. He'd long since stopped feeling much of anything out here. The vast expanse of the bay, offering no room for the emotions he tried to bury. He found his usual spot beneath the palm trees, where the branches cast long shadows over the sand. Lowering himself down, John leaned against the trunk, closing his eyes. The sound of the waves rolling in was steady, a constant rhythm that he clung to, hoping for a moment's peace. But the peace didn't last. A sound broke through the quiet, a faint, distant cry. John's eyes snapped open, his heart giving an involuntary jolt. He sat up, listening, but the cry faded as quickly as it had come. He waited, his body tense, wondering if he'd imagined it. The bay was deserted. It always was. There shouldn't have been anyone out here. Then the cry came again, louder this time. John stood, his pulse quickening. He scanned the shoreline, his eyes darting from tree to tree, but there was no one in sight. The cry sounded again, soft but unmistakable, the cry of a baby. His chest tightened. Memories he'd worked so hard to push away flooded back with a force that left him breathless. Jack, his son. He'd been so small, his cries just like this. John's hand shook as he gripped the trunk of the tree, fighting to keep his composure. The sound came from farther up the shore, near the cluster of palm trees. Against his better judgment, John began to walk toward it, his steps slow and cautious. Each cry seemed to pull him closer, tugging at the part of him he had tried to close off for so long. When he reached the trees, he stopped, staring at the small bundle nestled in the sand. A baby, no older than a few months, wrapped in a thin blanket. The child's face was flushed, the soft wail of hunger or fear breaking the stillness of the bay. John stood frozen, his mind spinning. He didn't want this, didn't want to feel anything. But the sight of the helpless child stirred something in him that he couldn't ignore. Memories of Jack, of holding him close, of his tiny fingers gripping John's hand, flooded his thoughts. He knelt down slowly, his hands trembling as he reached for the baby. The child's cries quieted slightly as John lifted him, the warmth of the small body pressed against him, sending a shiver through his chest. He had forgotten what this felt like, this weight, this responsibility. For a moment John hesitated. He could leave the child. He could walk away, go back to his boat, and pretend none of this had happened. But the thought of abandoning the baby, of leaving him here alone, gnawed at him in a way that he couldn't shake. Taking a deep breath, John cradled the baby closer, his decision made. The bay felt different now, less empty, the silence broken by the soft whimpers of the child in his arms. As he walked back toward the boat, the cries grew softer still, fading into quiet breaths as the baby drifted off to sleep. John glanced down at the child, his heart heavy with the weight of old wounds and new uncertainties. He didn't know what he was doing, didn't know if he could do this. But as he reached the edge of the water, the baby's warmth against his chest, he knew he couldn't turn back. Cedar Bay had always been a place of solitude for him, a place to escape the memories. But now, as he stood there, holding this tiny life, it became something else. The house felt different now. The silence that once clung to the walls was broken by the small, rhythmic breaths of the baby lying in the makeshift crib John had set up by the window. Outside, Rivertown was stirring with the early morning light, but John remained inside, pacing slowly across the floorboards. He hadn't meant to keep the child. He told himself that much every day. When he had brought the baby back from Cedar Bay, he'd fully intended to take him to the authorities, let them handle it. But the moment he crossed the threshold of his house, cradling the small bundle in his arms, something had changed. Now, days later, the baby was still there, nestled under old blankets John had dug out from the closet. He stood over the crib, looking down at the boy who had filled his home with a presence he hadn't felt in years. The child stirred, small hands twitching, but his eyes stayed closed. Word had spread quickly in the village. A few curious neighbors had come by, peeking through the windows, asking questions about the baby. Mary, who ran the corner store, had offered to help. "You can't do this alone," she had said, her brow furrowed as she watched John awkwardly hold the child. "A man like you. What do you know about raising a baby?" John hadn't answered her, and after a while she left. He didn't want help. He didn't want the questions. The baby wasn't staying, he reminded himself. This was temporary. But the days passed, and he found himself tidying the house in ways he hadn't bothered with in years. He cleared away old boxes, swept the dust from corners long forgotten, and rearranged furniture to make room for the crib. It wasn't much, but it was more than he'd done since before. The baby, a boy, John had determined, was quiet most of the time. When he wasn't sleeping, he would lie there, blinking up at the ceiling, his tiny fists clenching and unclenching, as if he were testing out the world. At night, when the village was still, John would sit in the chair by the window and listen to the baby's soft breaths. He didn't know what to do with the feeling that welled up in him as he watched over the child, the quiet protectiveness that had taken root in his chest. He hadn't felt this way since Jack. It was Jack's face that haunted him now, every time he looked at the baby. He saw the same wide, curious eyes, the same way his hands moved in restless sleep. John's throat tightened. He had thought he'd locked those memories away, but they had come flooding back the moment he'd found this boy on the shore. He didn't even have a name yet. John sat down heavily in the chair, the weight of everything pressing on him. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring at the small figure in the crib. He didn't know why it had taken him so long to acknowledge what was in front of him. The baby needed a name, and as much as it pained him, there was only one name that came to mind. "Jake," he said quietly, the sound of it strange on his tongue after all these years. It was bittersweet, naming the boy after the son he had lost. But it felt right, in a way that both comforted and ached. Jake wasn't a replacement, he knew that much, but there was something about this child's presence, something that made John feel less alone, even if he wasn't ready to admit it. The baby shifted in the crib, and John rose to check on him, his movements careful, deliberate. He adjusted the blanket, smoothing it over the child's tiny body, and then stood back, watching. Jake. The name hung in the air, filling the room with a new kind of quiet. Not the suffocating silence of grief, but something else, something lighter. The days in Rivertown stretched long and slow, the seasons blending together as time passed. The once sharp edges of grief had softened for John, though the memories of the past remained. He noticed the subtle changes in himself first. Small things that crept in unnoticed at first, like the smile that would pull at his lips when he watched Jake play in the front yard, or the way his hands no longer shook when he held the boy close. Jake was growing quickly, and with him the routines of John's life shifted, almost without John realizing it. Mornings were spent out on the boat, fishing together in the quiet of Cedar Bay. John would sit at the bow, casting the nets with practiced ease, while Jake watched, his small face scrunched in concentration as if he were learning every step, every motion. "Is it heavy?" Jake had asked one day, his voice full of curiosity as he watched John pull the net from the water. John had glanced at him, the sun catching the boy's bright eyes, and handed over a corner of the net. "See for yourself." Jake had grabbed it with both hands, grunting as he tried to help. His laughter, light and carefree, had echoed over the water when he nearly toppled over with the weight of it. John hadn't laughed, but a small smile had cracked the mask he so often wore. They settled into a rhythm. After fishing, they'd haul the catch back to the dock, and though the townsfolk still gave John his space, there was a difference in the way they looked at him now. Some would wave, and others would offer a nod of greeting. Mary, from the corner store, always had a word for Jake when they passed by. "Growing taller every day, aren't you, sweetheart?" she'd say, her tone warm, though her eyes would flick to John, assessing. Jake, ever curious, had begun to ask questions, innocent ones at first. "Why don't we ever go to the market, Dad?" Or, "Did you catch more fish when you were little?" John had brushed these off easily, focusing on the tasks at hand, but the questions grew harder to avoid. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sky turn pink with the fading daylight, Jake asked, "Dad, where was I born?" The question hung in the air between them, fragile and unexpected. John's grip tightened around the mug in his hands, the warmth of the tea suddenly distant. He could feel Jake's eyes on him, waiting, searching for answers that John wasn't ready to give. "You were born here," John said, his voice even, though the lie tasted bitter. Jake frowned, his small brow furrowing. "But I don't remember anything before." John stood abruptly, cutting the conversation short. "Time for bed, Jake." There was a flicker of hurt in Jake's eyes, but he didn't press. He was a good kid, too good for the weight of the truth that John couldn't yet bear to reveal. He watched as Jake shuffled inside, his small frame silhouetted against the fading light. Inside, their lives continued to intertwine. John would often catch himself watching Jake, the way he moved around the house, his energy filling every room. There were moments when John would see flickers of Jack in the boy, the way he tilted his head in thought or how his hands fidgeted when he was excited. Those moments were bittersweet, but they brought with them a quiet sense of healing. Their walks along the beach became a staple of their routine. Jake loved to run ahead, chasing the tide as it ebbed and flowed, his laughter mingling with the sound of the waves. John followed at a distance, watching, his heart lighter than it had been in years. He hadn't realized how much he had missed this simple joy of sharing life with someone else. He wasn't sure when it happened, but one day he realized that the heaviness he had carried for so long had lessened. He found himself speaking more when they went into town, sharing small words with the people he had once avoided. Jake's presence seemed to soften the edges of everything around him, including John's own heart. But the questions would come again. He knew that much. And when they did, John would have to decide if he was ready to face the truth, and if he was ready to let Jake in on the secret he had kept for so long. It was a typical morning in Rivertown, the sky a pale blue, streaked with the first hints of autumn. John and Jake had just returned from the docks, their catch modest but enough for the day's meals. Jake, with his usual energy, darted around the house, chattering about the big fish they almost caught. John, smiling softly, stood by the kitchen window, watching the boy's excitement. It was a routine, a life he had settled into, one that, for once, felt steady. But that steady feeling shattered when the sound of approaching cars broke through the quiet. John froze, his hand tightening on the cloth he was drying his hands with. He glanced outside and saw them. The black and white police cars pulling up along the dirt path, their lights off, but their presence ominous. His stomach twisted. Jake, sensing the tension in the air, stopped moving. "Dad?" His voice was small, uncertain. John didn't answer right away, his mind racing. What could this be? It didn't make sense. Then there was a knock at the door, loud, firm, and final. John opened it, his heart hammering in his chest. 2 officers stood there, their expressions grim. Behind them, a man in a suit stepped forward, his face sharp with anger. Robert Mayfield. A name John had only heard in passing, now stood on his doorstep. The man's eyes flickered over Jake before locking onto John with a gaze that sent a chill down his spine. "John Wilson?" one of the officers said. "Yes?" John's voice came out strained. The officer exchanged a quick glance with his partner before speaking again. You're under arrest for the kidnapping of Robert Mayfield's son." John felt the world tilt beneath him. Kidnapping. It didn't register at first. He stared at them, disbelief flooding his mind. "What? No, there's been a mistake." The officer's voice was steady, procedural. "Mr. Mayfield has identified the child as his son, who's been missing for years. You'll need to come with us." John looked at Jake, standing behind him, confusion and fear spreading across the boy's face. No, this isn't right," John said, his voice rising. "I didn't take him. I found him. He was abandoned." But the officers moved in, pulling his arms behind him with a mechanical efficiency. The cold bite of handcuffs snapped against his wrists. Jake's small voice cut through the chaos. "Dad, what's happening?" John turned his head, his panic rising. "Jake, it's going to be okay. Just stay inside." The boy's wide eyes filled with tears, his hands gripping the edge of the doorframe as if holding on could stop the world from falling apart. "Dad, where are they taking you?" John swallowed hard, trying to stay calm for Jake's sake, though the terror in his chest made it nearly impossible to breathe. "I'll be back. I promise." The officers led him toward the car, the sound of their boots crunching on gravel, the only noise in the thick, silent air. John tried to look back to reassure Jake, but the boy's figure was already fading as they pulled him further away. Robert Mayfield, standing off to the side, stared at the scene with cold eyes, his face unmoved by the emotional wreckage he was leaving behind. To him, this was just a matter of reclaiming what he believed was rightfully his. John was shoved into the back of the squad car, the door slamming shut behind him. He could see Jake standing in the doorway, small and fragile, tears streaking his cheeks. The weight of everything hit John like a wave. The accusations, the handcuffs, the sight of Jake alone, it all blurred into a single, crushing moment of helplessness. The engine roared to life, and as the car pulled away from the house, Rivertown's familiar streets passed by in a haze. John's mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. How could this be happening? How could they believe he had taken Jake? His hands, bound behind him, clenched into fists as panic bled into anger. He wasn't a kidnapper. He had saved Jake. He had given him a home when no one else cared enough to. But the town was silent as the car moved through, the people who had once nodded at him now keeping their distance, their gazes averted. The weight of the accusations hung heavy in the air, more real than any words he could speak. John closed his eyes, the image of Jake's tearful face burning into his mind. The ride to the police station felt endless. John sat in the back of the squad car, staring out at the passing fields and winding roads, his mind a knot of panic and disbelief. The low hum of the engine was the only sound, broken occasionally by the crackle of the police radio. The officers in the front said nothing to him, and John didn't bother asking questions. What could he say? The weight of the handcuffs dug into his wrists, a constant reminder of how quickly his life had unraveled. When they reached the station, the city's tall buildings loomed overhead. John hadn't been to the city in years. It felt cold, unfamiliar. As he was escorted inside, he kept his head down, his thoughts consumed by one thing: Jake. What was happening to him? Was he scared? Alone? The thought made John's chest tighten. He had to stay calm, had to keep his head clear for Jake's sake. In the sterile, dimly lit holding room, John sat on a metal chair, his hands still cuffed. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence. He stared at the floor, running over everything in his mind. There had to be a way out of this. He hadn't done anything wrong. He had saved Jake. How could they accuse him of kidnapping? Hours passed. The occasional officer walked by, glancing in his direction, but no one spoke to him. John's stomach churned with anxiety. He barely noticed the ache in his back from sitting so long. All he could think about was Jake. The fear of losing him for good gnawed at him, relentless and sharp. He couldn't lose Jake. Not like this. The door creaked open, and a man in a suit walked in, his expression unreadable. Robert Mayfield followed close behind, his face as cold and severe as it had been at John's house. John's heart pounded in his chest. This was the man who had torn his world apart, the man accusing him of something he hadn't done. He clenched his fists, fighting the urge to speak, to shout that this was all a mistake. The suited man, likely a detective, sat across from John, flipping open a file. "We've looked into the claims," he said, his voice calm, almost too calm for the storm brewing in John's chest. "It seems things aren't as straightforward as they first appeared." John's pulse quickened. He sat up straighter, his eyes flicking to Robert, who remained standing by the door, his arms crossed, watching intently. "We've learned some new information about Jake's disappearance," the detective continued, choosing his words carefully. "It appears his kidnapping wasn't random." John's brow furrowed. He could feel the tension in the room shift, a strange, uneasy energy settling in. "Mr. Mayfield," the detective said, turning to the businessman, "it seems your son was taken as part of a vendetta. Your past business dealings, some of your enemies, they wanted to hurt you. Jake was their way of doing that." The silence that followed was thick. Robert's face paled, his stoic demeanor cracking for the first time. "A vendetta," he repeated, more to himself than anyone else. John's heart raced, his mind struggling to keep up with the implications. The detective leaned back, closing the file. "You're not a criminal, Mr. Wilson. We've found no evidence that you had anything to do with the kidnapping. It seems you found Jake and took him in, caring for him when no one else was there." The relief that washed over John was immediate, but it was quickly overshadowed by the realization of what this all meant. Jake was Robert's son. No matter what happened now, that fact wouldn't change. The boy he had grown to love, the boy he had raised as his own, wasn't really his. And legally, John knew what that meant. Robert cleared his throat, breaking the tense silence. He hesitated, his gaze softening for the first time. "I owe you my thanks, Mr. Wilson. You saved my son when I couldn't. I can see that now." John said nothing, his throat tight. He couldn't focus on Robert's gratitude. All he could think about was Jake. The thought of being separated from him felt like a punch to the gut. The detective stood, signaling the end of the conversation. "We'll be in touch regarding the legal arrangements. For now, you're free to go." Free. The word felt hollow. John rose slowly, the weight of everything pressing down on him. He nodded, more out of habit than acknowledgement, and followed the officer out of the room. His body moved on autopilot, but his mind was far away. As he walked through the station, his thoughts returned to Jake, to the little boy who had brought light back into his life. He couldn't imagine losing him now, not after everything. The wind had died down by the time evening fell, leaving the air heavy with silence. John sat by the window, staring out at the dark sea. The waves were calm now, but the storm inside him hadn't settled. Tomorrow, Robert Mayfield would arrive to take Jake away. John had known this moment was coming, but it didn't make it any easier. The room felt too quiet, too empty, though Jake was just in the next room, asleep. He'd fallen asleep quickly after dinner, exhausted from the day's events, unaware of what tomorrow would bring. John had watched him drift off, his small body curled up under the old quilt Emily had made years ago. The sight of the boy, so peaceful in sleep, had filled John with a bitter-sweet ache. Robert Mayfield had been fair. He'd come to Rivertown and listened to John's story, heard about how the boy had been found and cared for, but Robert was Jake's father, and the law was on his side. Mayfield had thanked John for what he had done, even offered him something in return, a promise to open a business, a storefront in town where John could sell his catch directly to the city buyers, cutting out the middlemen. A generous offer. John's hands rested on his knees, calloused from years of fishing, now curled into fists. He knew Robert's offer was meant to ease the blow, to soften the guilt of taking Jake back to the city. "I'll make sure he visits," Robert had said earlier, his voice calm, his words carefully measured. "And that store? It'll bring in more money than you've seen in years. You'll be set for life, John." But John didn't care about the money. What was a store compared to the boy he'd raised? The boy who had brought life back into this house? The thought of waking up tomorrow and finding the house empty, the echo of Jake's laughter gone, it was more than he could bear. The sound of the waves outside reminded him of the nights they had spent out on the water together. Jake had always been curious, asking endless questions about the sea, the fish, and how John knew where to cast the nets. Those moments were theirs, shared between the boy and the man who had become his father, in all but name. The city was no place for a boy like Jake, John thought bitterly. Mayfield had told him about the schools, the parks, and the opportunities Jake would have in the city. But John had seen it in Jake's eyes. The boy didn't care about any of that. He cared about the sea, about Rivertown, about the simple life they had built together. Jake had tried to put on a brave face when Robert first arrived, but John had noticed the way the boy's shoulders had slumped when they talked about the city. "I'll miss the fishing," Jake had said quietly when Robert wasn't looking, his eyes distant. "I don't want to go." John had put a hand on the boy's shoulder, not knowing what to say. What could he say? He had no claim to Jake, no way to keep him here. "You'll come back," he had whispered, though the words had felt hollow. They both knew it wouldn't be the same. Now, as the night wore on, John felt the weight of tomorrow pressing down on him. The boy would be gone, taken to a life of luxury that John couldn't compete with. But would Jake be happy there? The city, with its tall buildings and crowded streets, seemed like another world entirely, a world far removed from the quiet rhythms of the sea. Jake had loved Rivertown. He had loved the early mornings on the boat, the smell of salt in the air, the thrill of pulling in a heavy net. The sea had been a part of him, just as it was a part of John. And now, all of that would be taken from him. John stood and walked to the doorway of Jake's room, leaning against the frame as he watched the boy sleep. He thought of how small Jake had been when he first found him, how much he had grown in these few years. Tomorrow, the house would be empty again, just as it had been before Jake came into his life. The evening was quiet, just as it had been the day Jake left. John sat at the kitchen table, staring at the worn wood beneath his hands, the hum of the sea faint through the open window. The house had felt emptier than ever these past weeks. He could still hear the sound of Jake's laughter echoing in the corners of each room, could still feel the boy's presence lingering in the air. But now, Rivertown was quieter. Too quiet. The news that the charges had been dropped hadn't brought John any comfort. Yes, he had been cleared of kidnapping, but it didn't matter. Robert Mayfield had taken Jake back to the city where the boy belonged, or at least where the law said he belonged. John exhaled slowly, his gaze drifting to the fishing nets piled by the door. He hadn't touched them since Jake left. The sea hadn't called to him like it once did. It felt like something was missing, like, without the boy by his side, there was no reason to go out on the water anymore. He knew Jake wasn't happy in the city. The letters had come, first from Robert, detailing Jake's adjustment to his new life, fancy schools, activities, opportunities John could never provide. But beneath the surface, John had sensed something was off. When the first letter from Jake arrived, written in his careful but clumsy handwriting, it became clear. "I miss the sea," Jake had written. "The city's loud, and everything moves too fast. I can't hear the waves here, not like back home." Home. The word stuck with John. He hadn't realized Jake thought of Rivertown that way. The sound of tires crunching on gravel outside pulled John from his thoughts. He stood, heart quickening, and moved to the door. The evening light cast long shadows across the yard, and at the edge of the path, a black car sat idling. John felt his chest tighten as the passenger door opened, and there he was, Jake, smaller than John remembered, standing there with a bag slung over his shoulder. For a moment, neither of them moved. The wind carried the scent of salt water through the air, and it felt like time had slowed. Then, with a sudden burst of energy, Jake took off running toward the house. John barely had time to brace himself before the boy slammed into him, wrapping his arms around John's waist, his face pressed into his chest. "I'm home, John," Jake whispered, his voice muffled but full of emotion. John closed his eyes and rested a hand on Jake's head. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. There was a weight to the silence between them that spoke louder than words. They stood like that for a while, the soft murmur of the sea in the background, as the last rays of sunlight disappeared over the horizon. After a moment, John pulled back slightly, his hands on Jake's shoulders. The boy looked up at him, his face a mix of relief and something deeper, something that John had carried for so long, an understanding of what it meant to belong to a place, to someone. "Come on," John said quietly, his voice rough. "Let's get you inside." Jake nodded, wiping at his eyes with the back of his sleeve, and followed John into the house. Inside, the familiar scent of wood and sea filled the air, and Jake immediately made his way to the table, just like he used to, setting his bag down with a thud. The house felt different now, fuller, as if Jake's presence had brought back the life that had drained from it over the past weeks. John watched the boy settle into the chair, his small hands resting on the table, as if no time had passed since the day he left. John moved to the kitchen, pulling out a plate of food he had prepared earlier, though he hadn't had much appetite. He set it in front of Jake, who looked up at him with a grateful smile before digging in. John leaned against the counter, watching him eat, a quiet warmth spreading through his chest. After a while, Jake paused, looking up from his plate. "Dad says I can stay here, so," he said, his voice soft. "He says he knows how much I miss it. He knows how much I miss you." John felt a lump rise in his throat but swallowed it down. "Is that what you want?" he asked, his voice steady, though his heart raced. Jake nodded, his eyes serious. "Yeah, this is where I belong." They didn't speak much after that. There was no need. The air between them was thick with understanding, an unspoken bond that had been there all along, only now it was stronger, more certain. John knew that the boy would always have a connection to the city, to his biological father, but here, by the sea, this was where Jake's heart lay. As the sun disappeared completely, leaving the house in a soft twilight glow, John stepped out onto the porch, Jake following close behind. They stood there together, side by side, watching the waves crash gently against the shore. The storm had passed. The sea was calm again, and so was John. For the first time in years, he felt at peace. Wow, what a journey we've just been on together. From John's heart-wrenching loss to the quiet strength of his bond with Jake, this story reminds us that home isn't just a place. It's the people we choose to hold close, no matter how far life pulls us apart. The sea may be unpredictable, but for John and Jake, it's where their hearts will always return. If this story touched you as much as it did me, don't forget to give this video a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. And hey, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss another powerful story like this one. Thanks for joining me today. I'll see you in the next video, where we continue exploring tales that inspire, challenge, and move us. Stay connected, and remember, home is where the heart finds peace. Until next time.